Briefly why I'm here, the title slide that was there a moment ago with my picture on it did mention that I used to be an engineer in the military space program, and I'm also a former, by God's grace, atheist. And I like to bring that up when I talk for a couple of reasons. We're often told in the creation evolution discussion or in the Christianity versus atheism discussion that the only reason that people are believing in the Bible, and creationists especially, are because we have these blinders on that don't allow us to see all the evidence for evolution, for atheism, and so on. The only reason that we believe the Bible and believe the creation, for example, viewpoint, is that because the Bible says so, and so we're required to. And that, again, if we weren't blinded by this pre-commitment to the Bible, then surely we would see all this evidence that disproves our various positions on things. And I'm one of many for whom the opposite was true. I became convinced that creation was true because of the evidence, and then became a Christian after that. So I became a creationist first and a Christian afterward. I'm not unique in that. I know a lot of other people in the creation movement who are like that. So just to make the point, there are many of us who affirm scientific evidence and say, yes, let's talk about science. Great, bring it on, because that's what brought us to this view in the first place. Now, having said that, believing in creation or scientific evidence for the Bible and such is not sufficient to make you a Christian. That's the work of the Holy Spirit. But it is a key point in this discussion, often with others. Now, I also want to point out my talk tonight is defeating atheism, not defeating atheists. It's all too easy when talking to people to get caught up in trying to win an argument and forget that this isn't about an argument with another person. You're not trying to show who's got the better ideas or who's got more knowledge or more whatever it may be. You're trying to communicate with this person and make him think about the real ramifications and implications of his position. So as I'm talking tonight, if there's people in the audience that aren't Christians at this point, that may be atheists, I'll just point out I used to think like you currently do, and if I say things that kind of rankle, please understand I'm not trying to say anything to you personally. I am going after your belief system, not after you. I was once trapped in the same thing that you are within. You may not think that you're trapped at this point. That's a word I'm choosing to use because that's what I was. Anyway, let's move on here and talk about what is atheism anyway. Well, atheism comes from the Greek word atheos, which literally means no God. The prefix meaning no, and theos, which means God. So atheism is the belief that there is no God. And if you're paying attention at all to our culture, you'll see that atheism is a lot more prevalent now, or at least a lot more vocal than it used to be. When I was an atheist in the 70s and 80s, we didn't really have atheists back then. We were all secular humanists. The focus was not on denying God. The focus was on, well, yeah, Christianity, that's a bunch of rubbish. But we had other goals. We were trying to better mankind through science and so on. Some of the authors who write these particular books now seem to have different motives. They're more interested in just being angry at God rather than trying to accomplish something necessarily fruitful. Personal opinion, anyway. But my main point is atheism is indeed getting a lot more prevalent, a lot more vocal, and a lot of people are reading these books and wondering, well, maybe what they're saying is right. That's what we're here to talk about this evening. Now, there's a lot of reasons within science, though, that some of us think are good reasons to believe that there is a creator. For example, this video here was made by a Harvard University showing what goes on inside of our bodies. This is showing a white blood cell rolling along one of your blood vessels. And again, this is happening in your body right now. You see the surface of the cell has various proteins associated with it, and I'm not going to give you an exhaustive list of everything that's going on here because we don't have time, frankly. But along the surface of the cell, we're going to see that there's a lot of things going on as this white blood cell is rolling through the blood vessel looking for an inflammation or infection to go fight, that being the role of this particular cell. Moving down into the cell, we see that it has a structure, cytoskeleton within the cell to give it structural rigidity and serve a few other purposes. And the cell actually assembles these structures as needed from proteins, and then will disassemble them when they're not needed to reuse the components elsewhere. Here's an enzyme snipping one of these chains, and you'll see that the various pieces are then broken up and then reused, in this case, to make a microtubule. Now, these are actually the highways inside the cell. Again, this one being broken down to be reused later. As a highway, you get motor proteins moving things around. And this little guy is real. He's inside your body right now, inside all of your cells, moving things around. This is moving a vesicle of proteins along to a different part of the cell. As we move further down now toward the nucleus, we're going to see some of the activity that goes on down there. We see messenger RNA coming out of the nucleus, and then ribosomes are going to read the RNA, from which they're going to get instructions to string together amino acids and build proteins. And then those proteins, in some cases, are assembled to make other little machines that go off to different parts of the cell to do all different jobs. In other places, they're injected directly, whereas in other places like here, we see these vesicles carrying lots of proteins to different destinations. And here's our friend the motor protein again, moving it along elsewhere. Now, all this, again, this is all real. Everything you see in this video is real. The only thing that the animators did was move things a little bit further apart so that there would be an interesting animation. We could see everything that's going on. When the vesicle reaches the surface of the cell, all the proteins are released. They have different roles. Here we see a lipid raft being assembled. And make a long story short, once all of the various pieces are in place here, everything gets ready, it all unfolds, and then grips onto the surface of the blood vessel and makes the white blood cell stop. At that point, the white blood cell realizes, hey, there's an inflammation, I need to go fight. It immediately breaks down the internal structure that you saw being built earlier so that it can then squeeze in between two other cells and go off into the tissues, seeking the inflammation to fight. Now, that's one small process in however many processes going on inside of that one type of cell. And again, that's only one type of cell among many. And I'm not a biologist. I'm not the one to explain fully everything that's going on there. Maybe Chris can do that if anybody's interested. My point is, does this look intelligently designed? I would say yes. Of course, biology is not the only science that we have to look at in terms of the origins discussion. There's also the fact of how old are the various things around us. How old is the Earth, for example? A lot of people would say, well, carbon dating supports an old Earth, doesn't it? Well, actually, carbon dating is one of the favorite tools of creationists because we can point out that carbon dating actually supports a youth assessment of these objects rather than old age. Carbon-14, it turns out, is an element that decays very quickly. So quickly, in fact, that if the entire Earth were made out of carbon-14, it would all be gone in less than 1 million years. So if you see carbon in a sample, it means that object is far less than 1 million years old because there hasn't been enough time for all the carbon to disappear yet. Which is why it's very interesting when you take objects that are supposed to be millions of years old, according to the conventional interpretations, but you can find carbon-14 within them, like petrified wood, for example. Supposed to be millions of years old, according to conventional thinking, but it's got many samples people have submitted, turns out to have carbon-14 within it, which means it's only thousands of years old, not millions, because if it was more than thousands, there wouldn't be any carbon-14 left. Coal, same thing, supposed to be millions, still has carbon-14, apparently is only thousands of years old. Oil, same argument, has carbon-14 inside of it. Now, secular scientists will often answer this, this argument by saying, well, apparently, somehow your samples got contaminated with modern 14 on the way to the laboratory. Well, number one, these samples have been submitted to the best laboratories in the world, the standard ones everyone else uses, and they have long, elaborate procedures meant to eliminate contamination. You know, if our samples are getting contaminated, that means everybody else's are too. But just to disprove that point, some Bible-believing scientists took samples of diamonds and submitted those, and it turns out diamonds have carbon-14 deep inside them as well. And you can't say that carbon-14 somehow burrowed its way into a diamond because it's not going to do that. Diamonds are the hardest substance known. You're not going to get carbon permeating inside of it. And there's other areas of science we can look to as well, like dinosaurs. Now, those of you who have never been to a creation talk before might be surprised by this. What's a creationist doing talking about dinosaurs? Don't dinosaurs support the millions of years? Actually, no, dinosaurs are a great subject to talk about here. I'm one of many creation speakers in the area who has entire talks just on dinosaurs. Of course, this isn't a dinosaur talk tonight, so I'll limit myself just to mentioning a little bit, like the fact that we're finding soft tissue in dinosaur bones now. This apparently has been there all along, but nobody was looking for it because everybody knew that the dinosaur bones are millions of years old. But it turns out inside of these things, we're finding stuff like this. Does this look millions of years old to you? Soft, stretchy tissue. This is from the inside of a tyrannosaur leg bone, by the way. And inside of this, further examination reveals blood vessels and blood cells. This is tyrannosaur blood. millions of years old or thousands of years old? What's the more reasonable interpretation here? In fact, further study of this has revealed DNA within some of these samples as well. And DNA has actually been tested to see how quickly it'll break down, even under optimal conditions. Even if you freeze DNA and keep it in an anaerobic environment, it'll still break down naturally over time. After 6 million years, it'll all be gone, again, even if it's frozen and anaerobic. Of course, being out in a rock formation in Montana somewhere, this stuff is not frozen and it's not anaerobic, so it's going to break down a lot more quickly than that. But these samples are supposed to be 65 million years old, 10 times as long as the longest theoretical lifespan of DNA, yet we are finding DNA within some of these samples. So again, this is an argument for these things being thousands of years old, not millions. Within astronomy, this is my background. If you go through the secular models for where the various objects in the solar system come from, you come to some very interesting conclusions there. The secular models actually say that the gas and ice giant planets can't exist. And the terrestrial planets cause severe problems for the models as well. Now, of course, this isn't talked about in the secular science media. We're always told about how there's a swirling cloud of gas and dust billions of years ago, et cetera, et cetera. But talk to the people who are actually working with these models, and you find out that the true story is a bit different. Same thing in other areas of astronomy. Stars, for example. I have a whole talk just on stars and galaxies, but long story short, it turns out that the secular model, meaning the Big Bang here, can't produce stars. There's different mechanisms for star formation, but they all require stars to exist before more stars can be made. Because to create the conditions for star formation, you need an older star to blow up next to a gas cloud, or you need galaxies to collide and crunch the clouds together. Well, galaxies are made of stars, so they have to pre-exist. Several other things as well, but my point is they all require stars to exist before stars can be made. So the Big Bang model has a huge chicken and egg problem. You can't get stars until you already have them, which is why one of my astrophysics textbooks has quotes like this, that hundreds of ideas of how stars are formed have been advanced in the past decades, but we're still far from any real solution. The origin of stars represents one of the most fundamental unsolved problems of contemporary astrophysics. And I'm quoting secular scientists here just to make sure you understand. This isn't just me up here saying this. I'm getting this from textbooks and scientific journals. The universe we see when we look out to its furthest horizons contains 100 billion galaxies. Each of these galaxies contains another 100 billion stars. That's 10 to the 22 stars all told. The silent embarrassment of modern astrophysics is that we do not know how even a single one of these stars managed to form. Silent embarrassment. The formation of stars is one of the most fundamental problems in astrophysics. No current model can reproduce all the observations. Well, that last part's not true. The creation model works just fine, explains stars and galaxies and planets. But since they deny that that model can be valid, that model can be acceptable, they rule it out from the get-go, well, then they wind up in a situation where we don't really know where these objects came from. Yet again, somehow the science media dealing with the public and the museums and so on don't talk about these sorts of problems, do they? You got to dig into the journals and the textbooks in order to find this information. And of course, if stars can't form according to the secular model, that means you can't get galaxies either, because galaxies are big collections of stars, which is why you see quotes like this one: the formation of galaxies on larger scale structure remains TMIUPIMA, the most important unsolved problem in modern astrophysics. Now, I'm just throwing a few samples of typical things that you might hear about in a creation seminar, and in future sessions of this symposium, we'll be digging into these topics in a lot more detail. But just to bring it up here to point out, there is a lot of evidence that we could talk about to support a view of the Bible as accurate history. But the problem is, you talk to, in our example tonight, an atheist about some of these things, and in many cases, the atheist would be familiar with these arguments already, but won't really be swayed by them. Why? Well, because this debate isn't only about the evidence, it's really fundamentally about the worldview. What is a worldview? Well, a worldview is the set of assumptions that you make to interpret the world around you. It's sort of like a pair of glasses that you can never take off. Just like sunglasses will make everything darker, a worldview is how you view the world as a pair of glasses that colors the world that you never take off. Now, you can change it. You can take this one off and put a different one on, but you're always wearing one pair or another, is my point. And think about how powerful a worldview is. Let's say you go to a magic show, and there's the old stunt where the magician shows you his hat is empty, and then he pulls a rabbit out of it, right? Old cliched magic trick. You see this happen in front of you. Do you believe that this magician actually forced a rabbit to pop into existence out of nothing in front of you? No, right? You're sure it's a trick. Now, think about this. Why do you think it's a trick? Why are you sure that what you saw didn't actually happen? Well, because you know, because your worldview tells you rabbits don't appear out of nothing. So your worldview is so strong, you're willing to disbelieve your own senses before you question your worldview. You see how that works? So a lot of people don't consciously think about what worldview they have. Everybody has one. We all have them. Christians, atheists, everybody in between, whatever. Everybody has a worldview. And this is how we interpret, then, evidence around us. So creationists and evolutionists, or Christians and atheists, we all have the same evidence. We have the same fossils, we have the same stars and planets, we have the same biological organisms, whatever. But people reach different conclusions because they're looking at it through different worldviews. So the Christian sees that little video of a cell I showed you and said, wow, isn't it amazing evidence of God's creative handiwork and what he was able to do, making literally little molecular machines inside of our bodies. Whereas the atheist would say, again, coming from a non-biblical worldview, well, isn't it amazing what Darwinian evolution can do over millions of years? Christian says, well, look, I mean, carbon dating shows that these things are young, not millions of years old. The atheist would say, well, apparently they got contaminated somehow. Christian says, well, look, dinosaur blood. Surely dinosaur blood must only be thousands and not millions of years old. The atheist would say, well, what do you know? I guess blood can last millions of years after all. Christian says the heavens declare the glory of God. Look at all this, and your secular models can't produce the things that we see. The atheist says, well, we'll figure it out eventually. So on the surface, it might seem then that both sides of this, because we're coming at it from different worldviews, are sort of just knocking heads and aren't really going to get anywhere because it's my worldview over here and your worldview over there, and never the twain shall meet. But the purpose of our talk tonight is to really dig into this a little further and say, well, these worldviews are not equal. The atheist thinks that by denying the Bible, he can interpret the world around him accurately, but he's actually sinking without knowing it. The Bible is the foundation of human knowledge in many different areas: ethics, mathematics, logic, purpose, morality, science, and so on and so on. So for the atheist to deny the Bible is true leaves him looking for a new foundation for all of those things. And as we'll see later in the talk this evening, he can't get one. And I like to compare it to this. For an atheist to try to use an argument from science to discredit the Bible is sort of like someone sending you an email that says, I don't believe in email. Email does not exist. Now, if someone sent you that email, what would you think? They're either joking or, they need help somehow. Because they had to use email in order to send this message to you denying that email is real. If email wasn't real, they couldn't have sent you the message, obviously. Well, the same thing applies to an atheist who tries to use science to discredit the Bible. He's actually blowing up his own position by doing so, because if science is true, atheism is not. So the rest of our time tonight, here's what we'll be doing. First, we'll talk a little bit about science itself. What is science? There's some common misunderstandings floating around in our culture, especially lately, that we'll talk about. But we'll spend most of our time showing that a Christian worldview makes science possible. And indeed, as we'll see, the early history of modern science comes primarily from Christians, or at least people coming from a Christian worldview. On the other hand, atheism, when applied consistently, makes science impossible. So before we try to contrast worldviews, let's talk about what the atheist worldview is. Of course, when constructing a worldview, you have to answer some basic questions. Number one, there's a universe here. What do we do with that? Where did that come from? Well, the pretty obvious question is it eternal or not? Has it always been there, or did it have a beginning? Now, there used to be different answers to this over in the atheist camp. There used to be a group of people called steady-staters that proposed that the universe was indeed eternal and had always been there. But that got disproved in the mid-'60s and thrown out. So there are very few atheists today who would say that the universe is eternal. Everybody pretty much acknowledges that the universe had a beginning. However, they do say that that beginning did not have a creator involved. Now, of course, the most popular beginning model today among secular scientists is the Big Bang. but they would deny that any creator or anything external to the universe took a role in that. As Carl Sagan, famous astronomer, once said, the cosmos is all that is, or ever was, or ever will be. Nothing outside the cosmos, no creator desirable or necessary. So the implications of this are, well, if the universe had a beginning, but there was no creator, then that means the universe had to create itself, right? If there's nothing external to the universe by definition, the universe is all that there is. So if everything had a beginning and there's nothing outside of everything, then everything made itself at that beginning. Implication number 2 is that since there's nothing external to the universe and since the universe made itself in this self-creation event, the logical outcome of that is a view called materialism, which is that only what is material is real. Reality is just molecules in motion, just matter and energy. That's all there is in the universe, and ultimately. It comes in different forms. I mean, we look different than the chairs we're sitting in, but it's still just matter arranged in different ways. So matter and energy is all that is real or can be real according to the atheist worldview. We'll talk later about why that's important. So what claims are being made by those coming from the atheist worldview? Well, people like Richard Dawkins are, of course, the most vocal among atheists today. And you see the Richard Dawkins Foundation for Reason and Science. So what is commonly claimed is that the atheistic worldview is based on reason and science and does so in opposition to Christianity and other forms of religion. Professor Dawkins said, sincere people can be cruelly torn, almost in two, between the massive evidence of science on the one hand and their understanding of what their holy book tells them on the other. I think this is one of the truly bad things that religion can do to a human mind. So you see how he's contrasting massive evidence of science over here and then what your holy book, i.e. the Bible, says over here. He's setting those two in opposition. He's saying that they're opposite. Well, is that a valid way of looking at things? Well, let's talk for a moment about what is science anyway. And a lot of people misunderstand this, and not just atheists. A lot of people really haven't thought about this all that deeply. The word science comes from a Latin word meaning knowledge, and as you can see the definition here, a systematic enterprise that builds and organizes knowledge in the form of testable explanations and predictions about the universe. Okay, fine. How does that work out practically? Well, there's a common misconception, one, that confuses science, the study of science, with the study of history. What do I mean by that? Well, science works in the present. If you run a scientific experiment, that tells you what is happening right in front of you on the lab bench, for example. What is happening on the lab bench in front of you does not tell you what happened thousands or millions of years ago unless you apply some assumptions to it, because you weren't there to run the experiment back then. For example, I once had an atheist tell me, as they were building the Large Hadron Collider in Europe, an atheist told me that they were going to recreate the Big Bang inside this collider, and that would prove that the Big Bang happened. And even some articles in scientific journals said similar things. And I said, it's not going to prove anything. All it'll prove, and if you smash particles together in the collider, you'll see what happens. Yeah, that's very interesting science, and we'll learn some neat stuff about physics. That's not going to prove the Big Bang happened. It just proves that you were able to smash particles together in Europe somewhere. Now, if the Big Bang had actually happened, and if our model of the Big Bang were accurate, and if we could reproduce the conditions specified by that model in the collider, then it would tell us something interesting about history. But only if all those other assumptions are true does an experiment today tell us anything about the past. So you understand my point. A scientific experiment tells you what is happening in front of you today. It does not require a particular view of history unless you apply assumptions on top of that. And of course, assumptions are fallible, right? We have no way of knowing that our assumptions are true, because then they wouldn't be assumptions, then they would be facts. So a lot of people talk about, well, science proves evolution. Well, no, it doesn't. Experiments and science, things that we see in the world today, only tell us anything about the past, again, if we apply assumptions. And the questions about whether or not the assumptions are correct is often where the creation and evolution disagreement begins. Creationists and evolutionists alike agree on science that's being done today. I mean, a lot of good scientists are creationists. Where we disagree is on the assumptions used to interpret today's facts back into the past where no one was around to see things happen. Misconception 2 is confusing science and evolution and saying they're the same thing. Now, strictly speaking, this is not about atheism. This is about evolution, which, of course, is not the same as atheism. But since people like Professor Dawkins spend so much of their time promoting evolution, and since this is a common misconception, it's worth spending a few minutes on now. We find that a lot of people are really woefully confused about this, and I have as my example here Bill Nye, the science guy. Bill Nye has said that if you deny evolution, it means you can't understand science, basically, including a list that includes biology, dinosaurs and other fossils, radioactivity, and distant stars that are just like our own, but at a different point in the life cycle. So since he includes things like this, I think it's fair to say that he includes astronomy in his definition of evolution. He's using the word very broadly, which is fine. You can do that. So when he says things like this, I say to the grown-ups, if you want to deny evolution and live in your world that's completely inconsistent with everything we know, everything we observe in the universe, well, that's fine. But don't make your kids do it because we need them. We need scientifically literate voters and taxpayers for the future. We need engineers that can build stuff and solve problems. So you see what he's saying? If you deny evolution, you can't be scientifically literate, right? Now that's interesting because the history of science is built by people who didn't believe in evolution, who are very strong believers in the Bible. Isaac Newton invented physics, invented calculus, invented a whole long list of things that we take too long to even talk about. One of the scary genius types of history, very brilliant man, and not just in his intellect, but also in the scientific accomplishments, yet he wrote more about theology in the Bible than he did about science. Gregor Mendel, the father of modern genetics, also a Christian. James Clerk Maxwell, discoverer of electromagnetism and the 4 laws named after him. Brilliant, brilliant man. Very, very devout Christian. Johannes Kepler, discoverer of celestial mechanics and orbital mechanics, same thing. Galileo, Lord Kelvin, Michael Faraday, Louis Pasteur. I could go on and on. The giants of early science were, for the most part, Christians, or at least adhering to some version of a Christian worldview like deism. They would be very interested to find out that they're not scientifically literate because they don't believe that everything came from nothing. Now, you might say, well, those people are all older. Well, that's actually not true. Not all of them are. But even today, there's thousands of degreed scientists who do not agree with evolution and atheistic worldviews. This one article here lists almost 3,000 people. There's a lot more than that that are unwilling to come out in public because they'd lose their academic positions, unfortunately. My only point is, in the past, giants of science, most of them were Christians. Today, there's many degreed science that disagree with Darwinism and atheistic views also. So to say that you must believe in today's theory of evolution to be scientifically literate is just frankly rubbish. He also said that you need to believe in evolution in order to have engineers that can build stuff and solve problems. Now, that's an interesting statement. Again, let's use an example from astronomy. I would argue that one of the most challenging engineering projects humanity has ever undertaken was the Apollo moon mission. I mean, think about this. Imagine putting your hand down like this and balancing a pencil on its eraser on your finger like that. And then try to bring that all the way up as high as you can while keeping the pencil perfectly balanced the whole time. You're not allowed to touch it, by the way. You can provide no other support for it other than from underneath. Oh, and by the way, you have a friend standing next to you blowing on the pencil from random directions as you're doing this. Now, even without the friend, you're not going to be able to do this. Very difficult challenge. But that's exactly what happens with a rocket. All the thrust in a rocket comes from the bottom. It's got to balance itself on its column of fire as it goes up. So, and it's long and skinny, just like that pencil was. This is not an easy exercise, right? I mean, this is one of the reasons they call it rocket science, because it's very hard. Poke around on YouTube and you'll find examples of rockets doing really bad things in the launch pad and blowing up after. Because, again, this is very hard. Now, imagine the Saturn V rocket, which is what we're looking at here. This thing weighed 6.5 million pounds sitting on the launch pad, 360-some-odd feet high, as high as a 30-story skyscraper, had to go from 0 to 17,000 miles an hour in a few minutes. Think about the amount of energy that has to be released in a very short time to do that. Now, normally when we have a device that releases a tremendous amount of energy in a short time, we call that a bomb, right? So a rocket is basically a controlled bomb that has to do this balancing business and steer to where it needs to go and do all the rest of it. And that's only to get this thing in parking orbit around the Earth. That's just step one. Oh, and by the way, the rock is going to be breaking itself into pieces along the way as necessary. The actual mission to get all the way to the moon and back is very complicated, involving multiple stages. The ultimate goal is to get this thing, the command service module, and the lunar module there in one piece. You don't see the lunar module here because that's where the astronaut is who took this picture. The lunar module goes down to the surface. Astronauts get out, do their thing. Back in the lunar module, part of it launches itself back into space, dock with the command service module, and Lord willing, everybody makes it all the way home safely. Now again, tremendous engineering challenge to do this. According to people like Bill Nye, if you don't believe in evolution, you can't solve problems like this as an engineer. Well, if that were true, then the Apollo missions would have been impossible. Why is that? Well, if you must believe in evolution in order to do science, then I think it's fair to say you'd have to believe in astronomical evolution specifically, and maybe of the moon, in order to do good things in the moon mission, right? Well, the secular idea for where the moon came from is called the giant impact theory, the idea that early on in Earth's history, something the size of Mars came along, crashed into the Earth, and the debris sprayed up into space, and some of it formed into the moon. So if what Bill Nye said is correct, you would need to believe that theory in order to be able to do good engineering and get people to the moon and back, right? But the problem was nobody in the Apollo mission believed this. Am I saying they were all Christians and creationists? No. Some were, many were not. But among the ones who were not, they all believed these other three theories that were competing at the time of Apollo. Secular opinion at the time of Apollo was divided about which of these three theories for the moon's origin was correct. The problem is that when the samples that the astronauts brought back actually disproved all three theories one way or another. So all three theories got thrown away, and then a few years later, this model came out, and now this is the one that's currently accepted. But my point is, this model was not around at the time Apollo existed. Therefore, according to what Bill Nye said, no one believed in the correct evolutionary origin for the moon, so therefore they weren't able to build stuff and solve problems. Does this make sense? His line of reasoning here? Obviously not. You don't need to believe in secular origins idea to do good things. Oh, and by the way, most of these engineers did this before computers. They used slide rules. I also can't resist pointing out that this theory here has also been disproven. Starting in 2008, some scientists went back and restudied some of the soil samples that the astronauts brought back, found that the volcanic glasses in the soils have water inside of them. That wasn't discovered at first in the 70s because our equipment wasn't good enough, but now with better technology we were able to find more. And that's important because if there's water in the volcanic glass, well, the volcanic glass came from inside the moon. That means there's water inside the moon too. But this theory says there can be no water inside the moon because it all would have been vaporized by that giant collision. So secular scientists currently have no valid model for where the moon came from. Yet, nevertheless, this is still being taught in science media and science programs and science museums. Why is that? Because they don't have anything better to offer. I don't think that's a good reason for teaching something that you already know isn't true. So misconception 2 is confusing science and evolution, and hopefully I've made a good case as to why those two are separate things. Misconception 3 is to equate truth with majority opinion. You often see articles like this. People do surveys and say, well, look, leading scientists reject God. There's more atheists than Christians in various fields of science. Well, a lot of these studies are flawed, first of all. This particular one was published, I believe, in Nature. But even the National Center for Science Education, which is an anti-creation organization, that's their whole point for existing, was forced to back off from that study and say, well, that study was actually deeply flawed. It wasn't well designed for investigating religious views of scientists or anybody else, and so it's premature. There's really no reliable data there. But let's say surveys like this are accurate. Let's say the majority of scientists do actually reject God. Does that mean that there is no God? Well, no, because truth is not determined by majority opinion, right? I mean, if you want to go into a field where majority opinion rules, then go into politics, because that's what that's all about. Science doesn't work that way, though. Truth is not determined by majority opinion. And so it's interesting what other scientists might believe, but it's not especially relevant. To say that it is very important, though, which is what secular people in the media often claim, means you're running foul of what's called the Gadarian swine fallacy. Do you remember the story in the Gospels where Jesus cast demons out of a couple men, and the demons begged permission to go into the swine, and he granted permission, so they went into the swine, and then all the swine rushed into the lake and drowned? Well, the Gadarian swine fallacy, this is an actual fallacy within philosophy, by the way, is to point out that merely because the group is marching in formation together doesn't necessarily mean it's a good idea to join them. So just because all of scientists, even if they were all pointing in the same direction, which they're not, as I said earlier, but even if they were, that doesn't mean they're correct. The thing I like to use to illustrate this is to ask the question, what is fire? Now, you're going to wonder where I'm going with this. It's going to take a couple minutes, but you'll see why this is relevant at the end. You ever wonder what fire is? I mean, you put wood in a campfire, and then the mouse stops working. You put wood in the campfire. Apparently it's not the mouse, it's the computer. There's good news. There we go. You put wood in the campfire, the wood burns, and what's left, the ash, is obviously a lot less than what you started with, right? So something left. But what was it that left? Well, a man named George Stahl thought he had the answer to this. He figured out that all matter, all physical stuff, is made up of two things. Its essence, that which makes it wood in this case, plus phlogiston, which is sort of the essence of fire. Stahl was still influenced by some ideas from Aristotle, and he still thought in terms of essences. But he said, it makes a lot of sense that the wood is the essence of the wood plus fire, and that when you ignite the wood, all the phlogiston, all this essence of fire, if you will, escapes, and that now the phlogiston itself is invisible, but when it interacts with the air as it escapes, that's what flame is. And you can also sense that this is occurring because of the heat that's let off. So he realized, well, different things have different amounts of phlogiston in it, different amounts of this essence of fire. A rock, for example, has very little because a rock doesn't burn. You try to set it on fire, no phlogiston comes out, therefore it doesn't have any to begin with, whereas charcoal is almost pure phlogiston because it burns very hot and very easily and leaves very little residue. Not only that, when you heat metal, it was known that a powder will form on the outside of the metal. That powder was called a calx. So apparently metals will hold on to its phlogiston a little more strongly than wood will, for example, but nevertheless the phlogiston will still slowly leak out and leave this essence of the metal, its calx, behind. It was also realized that you could actually reverse this process and put the phlogiston back into the metal by smelting it with charcoal. Remember, charcoal is almost pure phlogiston. So take a metal that's been calcified, that's got this powder on its surface from where the phlogiston left, combine it with the phlogiston again, and you get the original metal back. Well, this is pretty cool. I mean, you take the phlogiston out, put it back in, do it as many times as you want. Then they realized, well, that explains some other things. For example, if you have a candle burning and you put a bowl over the candle eventually does what? Goes out. Why does it do that? Well, you can see the candle start to struggle and then go out. Apparently, as the phlogiston is being released into the air inside the bowl, the air gets saturated until it can't take anymore, and when it can no longer accept any more phlogiston, the candle then stops burning. So air that has been saturated with phlogiston was called phlogisticated air. Then it was found that not only candles burning will do this, mice will do the same thing. You put a mouse under a bowl, it too will eventually saturate the air until the air can't take anymore, and then the mouse dies. So it was then understood, well, respiration must also be related to combustion in this whole phlogiston process. Then it was found out that, well, when you heat mercury, you get a new kind of air that comes off of it. They didn't use the word gas at the time, they just called it air. So when you heat mercury and you capture the air that's released, this air has some interesting properties. Mice would live longer in it under a bowl. Candles would burn brighter. Well, that must mean this air had less phlogiston in it to begin with, so they called this dephlogisticated air. Then Henry Cavendish, very famous scientist, found out that when he dissolved metals in acid, he got a new kind of air that was inflammable, he called it, because it burned so quickly and so enthusiastically. He thought he had actually isolated or come close to isolating pure phlogiston because this was just almost explosive stuff. And other discoveries were made surrounding phlogiston as well, and I won't take the time to do it. Just to point out, phlogiston explained a long list of phenomena: combustion, respiration, fermentation, the reaction of acids and alkalis, formation of salts, calcination, and other things as well. Phlogiston was good science, right? It works. Well, a man named Antoine Lavoisier became dissatisfied with phlogiston for various reasons and announced that he was going to come up with a new system and that the system of Stahl would be shaken to its foundations. After a few years of work, he announced that there was no such thing as phlogiston after all, that dephlogisticated air was itself responsible for combustion and respiration. Today we call that oxygen. Calcination and other processes like this were explained as oxygen combining with the material, not phlogiston leaving the material. In Henry Cavendish's inflammable air is now known as hydrogen. Along the way, Lavoisier increased the table of elements from 4 to 33. He introduced a whole new language of chemistry. Basically, this is the beginning of modern chemistry right here with this one man, overturning the phlogiston theory and introducing this whole new way of looking at things. Within just about 20 years, all the phlogistians, the people who had believed in it and worked with it, said, you know, Lavoisier is right. This makes a lot more sense this way. And they all switched over to the new way of thinking. Joseph Priestley was left as the final phlogistian and went to his grave moaning that all his friends had abandoned him and got onto this newfangled trend here. And he was the only one left. Now, why did I take the time to talk about this? Phlogiston reigned in science for almost 100 years. Now, we look at it today and think this idea is kind of naive, right? I mean, how could they have believed that? Well, because it had a large body of evidence to support it. It explained a lot of things. It applied to a wide variety of phenomena, as I just said. Thinking phlogiston made perfect sense. You could go into your laboratory and think about an experiment based on phlogiston, run the experiment, and it would work. Well, sure, isn't that good confirmation that phlogiston's true? It was the consensus view. Everybody believed it. It seemed to explain so much. Several generations of scientists learned it and worked with it. There were scientists who were born, got their education, did an entire career in science based on phlogiston, and went to their graves still believing it. But ultimately, it was wrong. So do you see the point I'm making here? Lesson number one from phlogiston is just because everybody else around you believes a certain thing in science doesn't mean it's true, and it doesn't mean it's not going to be thrown away tomorrow. In fact, as I said, phlogiston reigned for almost 100 years. That's a long time. That's several generations of scientists, isn't it? Yet today, hardly anybody even knows what it is. Lesson two is that when a scientific paradigm dies, it can die very quickly. Phlogiston went from everybody knows it's true to, oh, nobody believes that anymore in just 20 years, which is not long at all. Lesson three is that this is how science works. This is how the scientific process works. People believe things, and then things accumulate that makes someone say, you know, there's a better way of looking at this, and then the old view gets abandoned and people go to the new way. In fact, entire books have been written. This is called the structure of scientific revolutions, if you can't see it from where you're seating. Science is always overturning previous beliefs in favor of new ones. So what is it that we know today that's not going to be thought true tomorrow? Ever wonder about that? So misconception 3 is to say that just because the majority of scientists happen to believe in evolution or happen to not believe in God or whatever, well, that's an interesting piece of information, but not especially relevant to what the truth is. Misconception 4, that atheism is compatible with science. Now, this is, of course, our main topic here tonight. What are the requirements of science? If you want to do science, what do you need? Now, here's a question I'm sure no one lays awake at night thinking about. But you might think, well, you need laboratory equipment, you need telescopes and microscopes and stuff. Or some people might be more fundamental and say, well, you need the scientific method. But I want to get really fundamental. What are the most fundamental things you need if you want to discover something about the universe? Well, I'd say the very first thing you need is for the universe to exist. I told you you got to think fundamentally, right? I mean, the most basic things. What are the most basic things? Number one, you need a universe to study, right? Number two, you need to exist within that universe to study, and you need to have reliable memories and senses in order to study the universe, don't you? You need reliable senses to be able to perceive the universe accurately, and you need reliable memory to make sure that you can recall your previous sensory input and build on that as you learn things over time. You also have to make sure that your intellect is adequate to understand the universe, don't you? I mean, we don't expect frogs or snails to be doing good science because they're incapable of comprehending the universe. They don't have the capacity to do so. If we're going to expect ourselves to do science, we need to know that we have the capacity to understand the universe. Looking further out now, the universe itself has to be built on order. If you're going to try to discover things about the universe, it has to behave in regular, orderly ways in order to allow you to discover them, doesn't it? Not only that those patterns of order must extend all through the universe. You also need laws of logic, and lastly, you need mathematics. Now, there's other things you could add to this list, but I'm trying to get the most basic fundamentals of science. Does everybody agree that all 7 of these are required in order to do science? That's reasonable? Yes? Does everybody agree that if you're missing even one of these, you can't really do science, right? Now, I'm going to argue that coming from a Christian worldview, you get all 7 of these. The Bible endorses all 7 of these, and you can know that all 7 of these are true if you're a Christian with a Christian worldview. Conversely, if you're an atheist coming from an atheistic worldview, of those 7, I'm going to argue you get none. In fact, several of these are going to contradict your atheistic worldview. So let's look at this. Number 1, the universe. Does it exist? Well, since I believe in the Bible, I can say yes, because in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That means that the heavens and the earth do actually exist, right? And of course, there's lots of other verses in Scripture we could point to. But yeah, clearly the Bible says the universe exists, so no problem. What about if you're an atheist, though? You're not, of course, going to rely on Scripture to tell you anything. You're going to deny that it's true. So where do you come up with justifying the existence of the universe? Well, since you believe in a self-created universe like we talked about, remember? Because the universe can't be eternal. Science says it can't be. Therefore, it must have had a beginning. But since there was no creator or anything external to the universe, that means it had to create itself. There was a time when there was no universe, and then there was a universe, and there was nobody or nothing else around to do it. The universe had to create itself. There was no time before the beginning. Most importantly, there was no cause for the beginning. There was no reason for this to happen. Now think about this. If the universe created itself, there had to be a point at which the universe did this for no reason, right? Because if the universe was the effect of a cause, something caused the universe, a cause has to precede its effect in time, doesn't it? The cause has to come first. But the Big Bang Theory specifically says time didn't begin until the Big Bang happened. The universe, popped into existence. Nothing preceded it because there was no time. There can be no before the Big Bang because there was no time before the universe existed. So at one point, at the very beginning, the universe had to create itself for no reason. There was no cause for this. There was no reason for this to have happened. But if there's no reason for the universe to have created itself, then there's no real reason to expect the universe to exist, is there? You have to assume that it did, but you can't provide a reason for it to doing so because there can be no reason given the constraints of the atheistic worldview. Does that make sense? I know we're getting kind of philosophical here. Now, an atheist would object to a lot of what I just said for the simple reason that, well, we know that it does exist, so why are you arguing about this? Well, I agree that it exists. That's not the point. The point is, why should it exist? My Christian worldview explains very well why it exists, because God made it. How does your worldview explain it? We're not discussing whether it exists. That's a given. We're talking about why. And so to answer it exists because it exists, well, that's not very helpful. Another answer that's gaining some traction here lately is that it could be part of a larger multiverse, and so there could be a cause out there in the multiverse that caused our universe. Multiverse actually buys the atheist more problems than it solves for him. I don't have time to talk about that tonight. I have an entire presentation on the Big Bang that goes into that. I will just point out for tonight, it raises larger philosophical problems than the one specific one here we're trying to solve. Multiverse actually denies science in even more additional ways than the atheistic worldview on its own does. And I'm going to address more about this in just a moment. First, let's move on to number 2, human observers. Can we reliably say that we exist with reliable memories and senses in this universe? Well, as a Christian, I can say that absolutely. God created a man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. God created man, so man exists. The psalmist wrote, "When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and stars which you have ordained." Well, who is I? I is the observer who is looking at God's creation. So again, over and over again, the Bible says we exist within the universe. So, no problem with this one then. If you're an atheist, though, you have to answer the question, why should we exist within this universe? Well, first of all, if you have no real reason for the universe to exist, then you have no reason for anything within it, including us, to exist either. But even if humans did exist, why should they be conscious beings with the capability of comprehending the universe? Because according to the materialistic worldview, which is the logical outcome of atheism, our brains are just bags of chemicals formed by Darwinian processes over time. How can bags of chemicals be conscious? Ever think about that? I had an atheist write to me one time, and he was not happy with my work in astronomy and said, from where do you get the arrogance to deny the consensus view of astronomers? And I wrote back and I said, well, I don't think it's arrogant to deny the consensus view. I think science itself denies the consensus view. But we'll talk about that later if you want. From now, I want to focus on something a little more interesting. You're calling me arrogant, but according to your worldview, your brain and my brain are just bags of chemicals formed by natural processes. How can a bag of chemicals be arrogant? How can a bag of chemicals be self-aware? How can a bag of chemicals know what arrogance is? How can a bag of chemicals perceive arrogance in another bag? He didn't know how to answer any of that. You see the point I was making. He's making assumptions to even try to challenge me on these questions. My point was, well, before we talk about the stuff up here, let's look at the foundation of your questions and see if they make any sense. And they don't. Bring this up with atheists who have thought about such things, and you're likely to get, well, we know that we exist. I mean, Descartes figured this one out a long time ago. I think, therefore I am. There's somebody thinking, right? Therefore I exist. Well, the question isn't whether or not you exist. Again, I agree we exist. The question is, why should we exist if the atheistic worldview is true? Why should we be conscious? A lot of atheists will say, well, consciousness is an emergent phenomenon. When matter is complicated enough, consciousness just comes out. So really? Well, show me that in the laboratory, please. Of course they can't. More and more people are saying consciousness is actually just an illusion. So, okay, well, let me get this right then, Mr. Atheist. Okay, so you're saying consciousness is an illusion? Yes. So you aren't really a conscious being because your consciousness is an illusion? Yes. But you're making so who then is telling me that consciousness is an illusion if you're not really there? If you don't really have a consciousness, then what being is communicating or trying to communicate this thought to me? And if our brains are just bags of chemicals and our thoughts are merely chemical reactions within them, which is ultimately what atheism requires, can chemical reactions really discern truth? Don't you need consciousness for that? But consciousness is a non-material thing, which the materialistic view ultimately has to deny, which is why they're saying it's an illusion and so on. The Big Bang Theory gets even more interesting with this. Now, of course, you don't have to believe in the Big Bang to be an atheist. I mean, atheism is a broader belief than just the Big Bang, but since most would accept the Big Bang as being the valid view of cosmic origins, the Big Bang has a problem that's been growing lately called Boltzmann brains. And I wish we had more time to talk about this because this is a lot of fun. I'll just quote this one article to you that kind of describes it. It could be the weirdest and most embarrassing prediction in the history of cosmology, if not science. If true, it would mean that you yourself are more likely to be some momentary fluctuation in the field of matter and energy out in space than a person with a real past in an orderly star-spangled cosmos. Your memories and the world you think you see around you are illusions. This bizarre picture is the outcome of a recent series of calculations that take some of the bedrock theories and discoveries of modern cosmology to the limit. Basic problem is that it's hard for nature to make a whole universe. The Big Bang model has gotten to the point where it's extremely contrived to try to make a universe from it. And so it turns out then it is much more probable and much easier that fragments of the universe were made, like planets, yourself in a spacesuit, or even in the most absurd and troubling example, a naked brain floating in space. In other words, the Big Bang theory has gotten so contrived and needs to be so finely tuned in the beginning of it that it's actually more probable that the Big Bang didn't happen and that the only thing that did happen was a brain popped out of nothingness, complete with false memories. So this room is not real. I'm not real. The people sitting on either side of you are not real. You're the only real thing in the universe. Your body, this room, everything else is an illusion. You didn't really walk into this room at the beginning of the talk because there was no beginning of the talk. That's a false memory because your brain popped into existence with chemicals arranged in such a way with these fake memories Oh, and by the way, you're going to die in a couple seconds anyway because there's no body to support you. Meanwhile, you're having this illusion that there's a real world around you. Article goes on, nature tends to do what's easiest from the standpoint of probability, and so these brains would appear more frequently than full-fledged universes. Alan Guth, who's a rock star among cosmologists, by the way, pointed out that some calculations result in an infinite number of free-floating brains for every normal brain, making it infinitely unlikely for us to be normal brains with real bodies in a real universe. Now, this is real stuff now. Now, you're not going to see this in the science programs because it's obviously ridiculous, and even the cosmologists who are talking about this don't believe it because they say, well, this is obviously absurd, but that's what their theories predict. They're saying it's absurd in spite of what their theories say, not in accordance with what their theories say. And just to clear what we're talking about, this is not saying that you're a brain floating in the universe all by yourself because there is no universe. This is what it's talking about. You are a brain with nothing else around you because there is nothing else. And of course, if there is nothing else, there's no universe to study, and therefore there can be no knowledge of science. Now, I'm not saying atheists believe this. Most of them have never heard of this, and they'll look at you funny if you try to bring it up. My point is, this is where atheism taken to its logical conclusion winds up. You can't even be certain that there is a universe out there to study, which means you can't do science. Number 3, are humans adequate to understand the universe in the first place? Well, the Bible says yes. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork. That means that the heavens are capable of declaring God's glory, and we're capable of comprehending that glory, right? So as Christians, we don't have a problem with this. Atheism, however, ultimately has to say that our brains aren't really trustworthy. Because if our brains weren't intelligently designed, why should we trust them? Right? Why should a bag of chemicals be able to perceive the universe accurately and draw true conclusions? No real reason for that, right? Now, most atheists would object to that if they thought about this. Well, evolution gives us well-functioning senses and brains, so we can trust them. Well, problem with that, though, 2 problems actually. Alvin Plantinga, a Christian philosopher, has pointed out that evolution only selects for survivability, not for the brain to perceive things truthfully. Now, that's a long argument, and I will refer you to his work if you want to chase that one down. I would just point out it doesn't matter because to say evolution means we can trust our brains is circular reasoning. The atheist is saying we can trust our brains because evolution is true. Well, we can trust evolution is true because we perceive it with our brains. So we can trust evolution because we can trust our brains. We can trust our brains because we can trust evolution. Round and round we go. You see how there's no external foundation for any sort of truth here. And I'm going to have to speed up a bit because my time is drawing to a close. Order and regularity, does the universe have it? The Bible says yes. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night will not cease. Can an atheist, however, affirm that the universe is orderly? I would say no. Think about this. If there was no cause for the beginning of the universe, which there could be no cause in the atheistic worldview, consistently, then that beginning must have been a random event, right? There was no reason for it. And cosmologists would agree. The universe is simply one of those things that happens from time to time. Another guy said, maybe there is no ultimate cause for the universe. It just happened. Well, if the universe was born in randomness and chaos and things that happen for no reason, they just happen, what right do you have to demand the universe to operate according to strict laws of physics from that point on? Is that being consistent? No, it's being inconsistent. But you need to be able to demand, you need to be able to expect that the universe operates according to laws of physics in order to discover them, right? A universe that's founded in chaos and randomness cannot be expected to adhere to laws of physics afterward. Therefore, a consistent atheist has no real justification for science. Now, some would object, but we observe patterns anyway. We know the universe is orderly. Well, I agree the universe is orderly. That's because God created it that way. But coming from your atheism, how do you justify its orderliness? And there are those who are thoughtful enough to realize that there's a problem for them. It's not at all natural that laws of nature exist, much less that man is able to discover them. That's where the atheistic worldview gets you. And because my time is short, I'm going to skip a section here. This is my first time giving the talk in this format, so. Laws of logic, another requirement for science. As Christians, not a problem. Come now, let us reason together, saith the Lord. God thinks logically and expects us to do so as well. So as Christians, we can affirm logic. We can affirm that logic comes from the Creator, that it's abstract and non-physical, and that it's absolute and universal because it has an external source. The atheist, however, has no real basis for logic. Why is that? Because the atheistic universe is just matter and energy. Remember, it's materialism is the underlying idea here. Only that which is material is real. There was a debate a few years ago, well, quite a few years ago now, between an atheist and a Christian. Gordon Stein, famous atheist at the time, and Greg Bahnsen, a Christian professor. And Stein got up there using the usual, oh, God is evil because this, that, and the other, and the Bible is wrong, and blah, blah, blah. And Bahnsen said, you know, I disagree with all that, but set that all aside. Dr. Stein, you're a materialist. I read your works, you're a materialist, right? Yes. That means only that which is material, that which is physical, can be real. Yes. Well, therefore, you deny laws of logic, don't you? What? Stein didn't know what he's talking about. Well, laws of logic aren't physical things. They're not material. I mean, you can't hold a law of logic in your hand, right? It's just a concept. It's mental rules that we use. But your worldview denies that anything non-material can exist. Since laws of logic are non-material, you're denying that logic can be true, because if something that can't exist can't be true either, can it? Stein had no answer for that. And he tried to get her out of it the rest of the debate, and Bahnsen just kept hammering him. Stop bringing up all these other topics. You need to establish a foundation. What right do you have to be even using logic in our argument here, in our debate here this evening, when your worldview actually says it doesn't exist? So a consistent atheist can't actually affirm the truth of logic. Now, they'll say, well, we can use logic because it works. Well, I agree that it works, Mr. Atheist, but your worldview says it shouldn't. Some will say, well, logic is just a human construct. It's a convention that we decide to use. Well, that doesn't work either, because if we choose to use it, we can also choose to use different versions of it or choose not to use it at all. Is science going to work if an equation can be both true and false at the same time? Or does science require logic to be true in order to work? I think the answer to that's clear. Sometimes you'll hear, well, I'm an atheist, but I can still use logic anyway. Well, yes, that's because you're acting like me, a Christian, instead of acting like a consistent atheist. Last one, mathematics. The Bible says in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth and all that's in them. So the Bible uses numbers from the very beginning of creation, right? So therefore we can say, yeah, numbers are real things. Heavens declare the glory of God. There's no speech or language where their voice is not heard. The Bible talks about a universal language spreading out through, or that pervades all of creation, that surpasses all human language, and that's why we can all understand that there is a creator. If you study physics, you'll be struck by the fact that there is a universal language that pervades creation, and it's mathematics. I'm showing you here Maxwell's equations of electromagnetism. I was stunned when I studied these in college. Number one, the beauty of them. Number two, the off-the-charts brilliance of Maxwell to figure this stuff out. But number three, the fact that the universe has this order to it. Even among secular scientists, some are acknowledging this. Come on, computer, you can do it. And there's a book out now by a cosmologist, just came out 2 months ago, called Our Mathematical Universe. He proposes that our universe is actually math, and physical reality is just a manifestation of that. Now, that's dragging in Eastern religion concepts, but my point is, even he is admitting how pervasive mathematics is. Now, an atheist, however, has a real problem with math existing. Because, see, before the Enlightenment, mathematicians and scientists said, we are discovering what God has built into the creation. Once the Enlightenment happened and people started to say, well, maybe there is no God. Well, if there's no God, then God didn't create mathematics, so what is mathematics anyway? Well, it must be a human invention. So today, the widespread view is not that math is something we discover, it's something we invent. It's just a fun mental game that mathematicians play. So, you could comment like this: math is the most original creation of the human spirit. This guy said a mathematician is entirely free within the limits of his own imagination to make whatever words he pleases. He's not discovering the fundamental principles of the universe, and he's not becoming acquainted with the ideas of God. This guy said numbers are free creations of the human mind. Think about this. Numbers are not real according to this view, are they? 2 plus 2 doesn't really equal 4 because 2 plus 2 aren't real things. They're just mental games that mathematicians play. Math is a body of knowledge containing no truths. Really? Math has no truth whatsoever. well, that means that these wouldn't be true. But these are true. This tells us how electricity and magnetism work, these 4 equations right here. In fact, physics, if you've ever taken physics, you'll know physics is math, right? And the old joke goes, when you get a degree in physics, they throw in a degree in math as a bonus. Because math is everywhere through physics. If you're going to say math is just something that people made up, that it's devoid of truth, now you're saying physics isn't real either. Science isn't real. That's the actual logical implication of where the atheist must wind up with this. This guy said, why the external should obey the laws of logic, why in fact science should be possible, is not at all an easy question to answer. When you deny a creator, then you ultimately have to say math isn't real, and then you have to say science isn't real. Well, why do math and science work so well? Well, we don't know. The miracle of the appropriateness of math for the formulation of physics is a wonderful gift, which we neither understand nor deserve. The enormous usefulness of mathematics and the natural sciences is something bordering on the mysterious, and there's no rational explanation for it. No, there's a perfectly rational explanation. There's a God of order who created the universe according to mathematics. But the best atheism can offer is that math is, even though it's devoid of truth, mathematics has given man miraculous power over nature. Is that really possible? Does that make sense? That a fun mental game that the mathematicians made up with no truth whatsoever, zero truth, nevertheless somehow is the basis of science, which describes everything from faraway galaxies to the operation of microscopic cells. Now, as Christians, we don't have this problem. Leonhard Euler, for example, probably the greatest mathematician in history. I mean, he made a long list of contributions to math and physics. He was also a devout Christian who authored a book in defense of divine revelation against the objection of the freethinkers, defending the divine inspiration of Scripture against the atheists of his day. The giants in math and science understood that they were discovering what God had already built into the creation around them, and that's why they were able to accomplish so much. If you're going to be an atheist and come at this from an atheist worldview, you get math that's devoid of truth, you have no laws of logic because they're immaterial and therefore can't exist. You can't even be sure that you yourself exist or that the universe exists. You can't do science under those conditions. So brief review, we saw that there's 7 fundamentals of science. Christian worldview gives us all of those because the Bible says they're all true. Atheism ultimately gives you none of those. Skip forward a bit. People take it for granted that the physical world is both ordered and intelligible. The underlying order and nature of the laws of physics are just accepted as given, as brute facts, even though nobody asks where they came from. But even the most atheistic scientist accepts as an act of faith that the universe is not absurd, that there's a rational basis to physical existence that's at least partly comprehensible to us. So science can proceed only if the scientist adopts an essentially theological worldview. Interesting admission there. So when an atheist tries to use science and logic, etc., against a Christian worldview, he really has to assume that the Christian worldview is true, doesn't he? Because his atheism doesn't supply anything necessary to support science, logic, or the rest of it. It's like the guy sending you an email saying email doesn't exist. He had to use email to send that to you. So when an atheist therefore uses science and logic, he's really discrediting his own worldview because those things are incompatible with it. So although he might think he can use science as a weapon against Christianity, this is really the only weapon he's using. The Bible says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. So when you deny the Lord, you're not going to wind up at valid knowledge. Because instead, the heavens declare the glory of God. The creation proclaims the glory of our Creator, as indeed we see. I have a newsletter on creation astronomy, free email. You can go to my site, creationastronomy.com. If you like this kind of perspective on things, obviously it focuses on astronomy, whereas tonight's talk was more about worldviews. That's available to you. There's also a couple DVDs. I mentioned earlier that I have several talks on the solar system and such, exposing the secular model's problems and explaining any of this. Those are available on the book tables back there. And I thank you for your attention. Let's close in prayer. Father in heaven, we thank you, Lord, that we can gather in your name. We thank you, Father, that you have given us the ability, Lord, to perceive it in some small aspect at least, Lord, your glory in that which you've revealed to us. Father, please help us to use this to glorify you more, Lord, to serve and worship you better, and to share your truth with others, Lord. Please give us the ability to do so. Grant us grace and wisdom, proper words to use. We just thank you and praise you, Lord, for all things. In the name of your Son, we pray. Amen.
You guys thank Spike.
Thank you.
So we're going to take up an offering briefly. So if you want to get that ready again, make out any checks to Cedar Park. All the funds are going to be turned over directly to them. But we do have a lot of expenses. We don't want this to cost the church anything at all. So travel expenses on the speakers that we're bringing in the future, our videographers, our sound guys, we got to cover a lot of expenses. So our usher's going to come forward and begin an offering. We have an opportunity. We got to kind of close here in a little bit, but we want to give you an opportunity to ask a couple of questions. We can only take about 2 or 3 because we want to close down pretty promptly at 8:30. So if you have a question for Spike, then raise your hand, make your way out to the aisle, and I'll come around.
Make sure it's questions I can answer quickly.
Recently there was something on the news about at the South Pole they had found the evidence for the Big Bang, and they were all at Twitter about it. Do you know what that was all about?
Yes. The discovery was a pattern of polarization in the microwave background radiation, which certain versions of the Big Bang theory had predicted would be found. So the media was proclaiming the smoking gun for the Big Bang is found, this proves beyond a shadow of a doubt, et cetera, et cetera. As frequently happens, the media was really overstating the case. Even among cosmologists, a lot of them said, we are cautiously optimistic that something was found here, but it needs to be confirmed. First of all, this is just one study that was done. So even the cosmologists who believe the Big Bang say, no, we need more studies to confirm that what is being claimed here is real. There was also some questions about certain numbers within the data that were not what expected. Some people had concerns about that. But even setting all of that aside, so briefly what they found was, when we look in the sky and look into deep space, there's radiation coming at us from all directions. Now, obviously, there's starlight as radiation, and there's galaxies and whatever else. But subtract all that out, even in space where would appear to be nothing, there's still a very low temperature radiation down in the microwaves coming at us from all directions. And Big Bangers interpret that as a certain event early in the history of the Big Bang, 380,000 years after the beginning, that would have produced this big burst of radiation that we're seeing the remnants of today. Now, this is very, very low temperature. We're talking 2.7 degrees Kelvin, 2.7 degrees above absolute zero. And there's very, very slight differences within that from one spot to another. And what they announced here recently was differences in polarization coming at us. Imagine a photon kind of swirling on the way down to us, and they're swirling in different patterns. It's not something you can point to one spot in the sky and say, oh, from this direction we're getting this temperature or this polarization. These are statistical analysis, meaning they took all the data and they had to filter out a whole bunch of stuff and crunch a bunch of numbers and then say, well, on average we're seeing this, that, and the other. So there's levels of interpretation going on already between observations and the data that are being proclaimed. But even setting all that aside, even if the data were actually what they're claiming, it doesn't prove that the Big Bang happened. It would prove that if the Big Bang happened and if certain theories of inflation are true, that what we're looking for, constrains some of their models more tightly. But there are creation cosmologies that also say there should be a microwave background in all directions, and that also say that the universe would have been filled with an early hot plasma, which presumably would have gravitational waves which would leave a similar sort of imprint. So what they found, if they found what they claimed to have found, that would be consistent with a couple versions of the Big Bang and maybe less consistent with some other versions, but it's also consistent with some creation cosmologies as well. So it's inaccurate to say, oh, this is the smoking gun for the Big Bang, it proves beyond a shadow of a doubt. It's kind of like someone's on trial for breaking into a house, and the prosecutor says, well, Your Honor, we figured out that if he indeed did break into the house, there'd be broken glass inside that window. We found the broken glass, so therefore we know he did it. Well, no, I mean something happened, but it doesn't mean it was the guy sitting here in front of you that you know. So same thing here. If that polarization pattern does indicate gravitational waves early in the history of the universe, that will be consistent with some versions of the Big Bang, but it would also be consistent with some creation cosmologies. So therefore, you can't say it proves the Big Bang happened if it also supports other histories as well. Does that make sense to everybody? I had to greatly oversimplify that, but hopefully that made sense.
At the beginning of your talk, you mentioned carbon-14 and how it goes away after less than 1 million years, I think you said?
Well, I said if the entire Earth were made of carbon-14, it would go away. Carbon has a half-life of a little over 5,000 years. I don't think she was done with her question there, Chris. So it goes away very quickly, and there's very little of it to begin with in nature around us.
Well, I was just wondering how we know that.
How we know that?
How do we know how long it takes to go away?
Because you can measure it in the laboratory, and it decays quick. Well, the way this stuff works is any given atom of an element that decays, you can't say for sure when that one's going to decay. It's a statistical analysis. So you take enough of it, and then you look at how they behave as a group, and then you can extrapolate. So for example, uranium is believed to have a half-life of about 4.5 billion years. No one has been watching a chunk of uranium for billions of years to see if that's true. What they do is they take a big chunk of it in the lab and say, well, in a year, so many atoms decayed out of however many gazillions you started with, and then we can calculate the ratios from there. So in the environment around us, carbon-14 is one of the things that decays very quickly as far as these dating methods go. So roughly a little more than 5,000 years is the half-life. So whatever amount you start with, 5,000 years later, half of it's gone. 10,000 years after the beginning, you're down to 1/4, half of the half, right? After 15,000 years, you're down to 1/8. So you see how it shrinks down very quickly, half times half times half times half. You don't have that many half-lives before there's only a couple atoms left, and then you can't detect it with your equipment anymore. Does that answer your question? Okay, good.
Yeah, I was going to get your take on the new Cosmos show on PBS. I don't know if you've been watching that, but it's got a very anti-theist take to it, and I just wondered, what your thoughts are if you've seen it. Or
I haven't seen it yet. I would like to. The first one was anti-theistic too, so they're consistent. Neil deGrasse Tyson, I mean, he's a wonderful communicator. I wish he was on our side. That's about all I can say. A brilliant man, funny, personable, great communicator. Just his worldview is wrong.
All right, very good. Give it up for Spike one more
thank
time.
you. Thank you for your attention.